Embarrassing things have happened in the NFL. Terrible calls that ruin games. Certain items being thrown on the field.
I thought it might have been a flag, but I didn't say it because it didn't look yellow.
And even the infamous wardrobe malfunction in the Super Bowl. All of these are pretty awkward moments, but one game in particular trumps them all. What happened during a game between the Raiders and the Jets during the 1968 season will go down as one of the biggest live TV blunders in the history of the NFL, if not all of sports. It's something that can't be replicated. It was such a big deal that it changed the course of how they dealt with live games after the fact. But before we dive in, this video is brought to you by SeatGeek. SeatGeek takes tickets from all across the web and puts them into one area, making buying simple. They're rated on a scale from 1 to 100, so you know you're getting a good deal. Plus, if you haven't yet, use my promo code KTO for $20 off your first purchase. Shout out to SeatGeek for the sponsor. Now let's go back in time.
As the 60s began, America was reaching into the heavens. Before the decade was over, pro football would attract the largest viewing audience in the history of sport, and man would walk on the moon.
Considering the time period, the Super Bowl era had just begun, and people were really starting to gravitate towards the sport. And since TVs were becoming the main source of home entertainment, it was perfect timing. The hype surrounding a late season matchup between the Raiders and the Jets was immense. Not only were these two of the best teams in football, but they had a bitter rivalry at the time. Jets guard Randy Rasmussen said, "Anytime we went into a Raiders game, we knew we were going to come out of it sore, guaranteed to get the crap beat out of you." Dislike isn't a word I'd use to describe how we felt about them. Downright hatred would be more accurate. But one thing was for sure, this game was must-watch television. Through 3.5 quarters, this matchup was what everyone was expecting. It had been a back-and-forth bloodbath. 6 lead changes, both teams battling till the bitter end. And with time winding down with just over a minute left in the game, the Jets nailed a 26-yard field goal, giving them a 3-point lead. At this point, if you had been watching the game, you were on the edge of your seat. Even though the Raiders only had a minute left, they had the best offense in football that year, so now it was time to prove it. Shortly after the kickoff, what would happen next shocked everyone watching on television.
Monica to Charlie.
If you were watching live, you'd be extremely confused. On one hand, they had been mentioning the premiere of the 1968 film Heidi that was coming up after the game. But on the other hand, the fourth quarter wasn't over yet. The Raiders were driving down the field, and now the movie's starting? What in the world was going on here? NBC phones started buzzing like crazy. They began receiving thousands of calls at once. It was so much so that it began blowing out the switchboards. Since all the phone lines were flooded with angry fans, apparently former NBC president Julian Goodman couldn't reach the head of broadcast operations to tell him to put the game back on. Fans were stuck. Many turned off the TV in frustration, and others assumed the Jets had won. But for those who kept watching the movie Heidi, in one of the show's most touching scenes where a little girl who's crippled is trying to walk for the very first time, they posted the final score. This mostly just pissed off the people who were watching at that point, because pretty much anyone who was watching the game had already turned off their TV. So let's rewind a bit. Here's what happened. Back then, NFL games ran for roughly 2 hours and 30 minutes. And because they didn't have overtime rules back then, games ended in regulation no matter what. The game started at 4 p.m., and since the movie Heidi had been hyped up as, quote, the best TV program of the day, NBC was inclined to favor the movie over the game. Heidi's producers demanded that it go on air promptly at 7 p.m. NBC wasn't too worried though, because no game had ever gone 3 hours on their network. But of course, this game was taking longer than expected. Lots of scoring, incomplete passes, 19 penalties. Every timeout was used. It was the perfect storm. And at the start of the fourth quarter, NBC executives realized that the game probably wasn't going to end before 7. There was nothing that they could do, and that's when panic ensued. A phone call took place. Executives started talking. They almost delayed the start of the movie, then changed their minds last second. People on the West Coast actually saw the end of the game, but the eastern half of the United States was stuck watching Heidi. Keep in mind, there's no internet, no sports center, and no cable. You had no other way of knowing the score other than watching it live, or getting the newspaper the next day. So many people on the East Coast went to sleep that night believing the Jets had won. Man, could you imagine being a Jets fan stoked that your team had just won, only to wake up, grab the morning paper, and see this? Actually, here's a pretty good story. Jets cornerback Johnny Sample flew back east after the game the following day, and his father picked him up from the Philadelphia airport.
I landed at the airport. My father said, "What's wrong?" He said, "You should be happy because you guys beat the Raiders." I said, "Dad, what are you talking about?" He said, "When they interrupted the game, you guys were up by 7, 8 points or whatever it was." I said, "Yeah, but we lost the game by 11.
The aftermath of the Heidi Bowl changed everything. The NFL was never going to let this happen again, so they added a clause to their contract guaranteeing that games in their entirety would be shown. NBC also made changes, adding a special phone line to ensure communication between executives and programmers. So this was a good thing for the future of live television related to sports. Oh yeah, it ended even better for the Jets. A few months later, they would take on the Raiders again in the AFL's championship game. They beat them. Then, on their way to the Super Bowl, Joe Namath famously guaranteed that they were going to win. And, well, they did.
Joe, you're king of the hill.
No, we're king of the hill. We got the team, brother.